The air over Nice in the summer of 1807 carried with it a whiff of salt and citrus. It was July, and the coastal town, perched between rugged mountains and the restless blue of the Mediterranean, bustled with life. Fishermen hauling in their morning catch, market sellers calling out beneath faded awnings, and foreign tongues mingling like the tides along the port. Amidst this warm Mediterranean hum, a child was born into a home touched by salt water and ambition. The son of a Ligurian sea captain, Domenico Garibaldi of Chiavari, and Maria Rosa Nicoletta Raimondi of Loano, he entered a world that was as much ocean as it was land. Nice, at the time of his birth, was no longer part of the Kingdom of Sardinia, but under the French Republic's control, thanks to the revolutionary surge that had spread across Europe. But political winds shifted quickly, and by the time the boy was 7, the Congress of Vienna had handed the region back to Victor Emmanuel I of Sardinia. The town would later change hands again, returning to France in 1860, though not without protest, especially from the boy who would grow up with fire in his heart and rebellion in his veins. From an early age, he was drawn to the horizon. The sea was not just a backdrop to his life, it was promise. His father's modest involvement in the coastal trade offered him stories of distant ports, stormy crossings, and foreign customs. These tales stirred in him a restlessness, a longing for purpose beyond the tide-washed shores of Nice. He was not made for quiet village life. He was made for movement. By his early 20s, that movement had carried him east, to the exotic sprawl of Istanbul, then still Constantinople. From 1828 to 1832, he lived in the Pera district, among narrow streets where Christian churches sat, beside Ottoman mosques, where Italian exiles whispered over strong coffee, and traders argued in half a dozen languages. The scent of spice markets drifted through the streets, and distant calls to prayer echoed through the hills. There, this young man, now fluent in French and Italian, taught language and mathematics, earning his bread in a world both alien and alluring. But Istanbul wasn't just a stop on his journey, it was a crucible. In those years, he fell in with the Sardinian Exile Network, a group of men and women who spoke of revolution in hushed voices and carried a vision of a unified Italy in their hearts. He was listening, and he was learning. This boy of the sea, born in a contested land, educated in a city of empires, was becoming something more, something bigger than the life he'd been born into. And his name was Giuseppe Garibaldi. It is the year 1835, and the winds over the Atlantic swell with warm, exotic promise. The ocean stretches endlessly, that carry not just salt and spray, but dreams, bold, chaotic, revolutionary dreams. And standing upon the deck of a creaking wooden ship, eyes narrowed against the tropical sun, is a man who has finally reached the far edge of the map, the coast of Brazil. Giuseppe Garibaldi, still young, still sculpted more by ideals than by victories, has crossed the seas to find himself in a land both raw and rebellious. He steps ashore into the Bailick of Tunis first, but it is Brazil that stirs his blood. Brazil with its lush green hills and deep red soil. Brazil, fractured and boiling with unrest. And there, just inland, the embers of a cause smoulder. Drawn like a moth to a fire, Garibaldi finds his way to the Rio Grandense Republic, a fledgling breakaway region of southern Brazil. They call their struggle the Ragamuffin War, a romantic name for a brutal fight. He joins the rebels, the so-called Ragamuffins, not for gold nor land, but for liberty, always liberty. And it is here, in the thick of smoke and the rhythm of gunfire, that fate throws him a match to ignite his heart. Her name is Anita, Ana Maria de Jesus Ribeiro da Silva, fierce, defiant, with a gaze as piercing as a blade. She climbs aboard his ship, the Rio Pardo, not as a stowaway or a companion, but as a comrade. Together they sail into battles like Imbituba and Laguna, not only shoulder to shoulder, but soul to soul. By 1841, war has taught them much. They leave Brazil's fires behind for Montevideo, Uruguay, where life briefly slows. Garibaldi becomes a trader and a schoolmaster. He marries Anita in the warm stone walls of the Church of St. Francis of Assisi, and they begin a family, 4 children, born of love and turbulence. But the drumbeat of conflict continues, and Giuseppe answers the call. In 1842, with Montevideo under siege, he forms the Italian Legion, soldiers wrapped in scarlet wool, their red shirts stitched not by tailors of war, but salvaged from a slaughterhouse shipment bound for Argentina. What was meant for the blood of cattle would soon carry the blood of patriots. The Legion marches under a black flag marked with a volcano. Italy in mourning, but never still. In Uruguay's civil war, Garibaldi sides with the Colorados, joins with exiled Italians and Unitarian Argentines, and earns his name on the battlefield. Colonia del Sacramento, Martin Garcia Island, and Gualeguaychú fall under his shadow, and his amphibious guerrilla tactics outwit many. In Costa Brava, he nearly meets his end, until an Argentine admiral named William Brown spares his life, calling him a brave man. In return, Giuseppe would one day name a grandson after him. All the while, Anita rides beside him, a brilliant horsewoman who teaches him the ways of the gauchos, those silent kings of the pampas. And from her, he learns not just culture and survival, but resilience. The red shirt, the wide-brimmed hat, the flame in his eyes, this Garibaldi is forged in South American fire. By 1848, the taste of revolution in Latin America has soaked into his bones, but his eyes are turning back across the ocean now, to his homeland, to a fractured Italy still waiting to wake from its centuries-long sleep. The old world is calling him home. Even as bullets flew and battles raged in South America, Giuseppe Garibaldi found himself stepping into a different kind of brotherhood, one bound not by rank or regiment, but by ritual, secrecy, and a shared vision of progress. In the warm Montevideo evenings of 1844, behind the closed doors of a small lodge known as Asilo della Virtud, Garibaldi was initiated into the Freemasons. The lodge itself was irregular, unrecognized by the major Masonic obediences of Europe, but for political exiles and revolutionaries scattered across the Atlantic world, it was more than enough. It was sanctuary, it was connection, it was purpose. Garibaldi, now 37, had little interest in the elaborate handshakes or symbolic aprons. He saw in Freemasonry something far more potent, a global web of like-minded men who dreamed, as he did, of a freer, fairer world. From Montevideo to Marseille, Buenos Aires to Bologna, lodges offered not just shelter, but solidarity. Later that same year he would regularize his standing, joining Les Amis de la Patrie, a Montevideo lodge recognized by the Grand Orient de France. And decades later, his faith in the Masonic ideals would see him rise all the way to Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Italy itself, a position of honor, but also deep symbolism. This was not mere social ceremony to Garibaldi. It was revolution by candlelight, quiet fires waiting to be fanned into flame, and it burned strongest for one place above all, home. Across the Atlantic, Italy stirred. In 1846, a new Pope, Pius IX, began enacting reforms that electrified patriots like Garibaldi and Mazzini. For a moment it seemed even the Vatican had caught the scent of liberty on the wind. Garibaldi, never one to hesitate, sent a letter to Rome from South America. If these hands, used to fighting, would be acceptable to His Holiness, we most thankfully dedicate them to the service of Him who deserves so well of the Church and of the fatherland. But diplomacy alone could not satisfy him, and in 1847, as the revolutionary fires crackled in Sicily and on the mainland, Garibaldi prepared to return. 60 men, ragged, loyal, and forged by years of battle, gathered under his banner once more. He was going home, and this time he would bring the fire with him. When Garibaldi stepped once more onto Italian soil in 1848, it was not the same Italy he had left. It was not yet Italy at all, but a land fractured by kings, occupied by emperors, and smouldering with the fires of revolution. From the northern plains of Lombardy to the sun-baked slopes of Sicily, the people were rising. Revolution had swept across Europe like a storm, and Italy, long shackled by foreign powers and divided loyalties, was now echoing with the cry of freedom. Garibaldi, hardened by the dust and gunpowder of South America, did not return as a wandering soldier. He returned as a man with a mission. He reached out first to Charles Albert of Sardinia, who, at least outwardly, posed as a liberal monarch. But the king's cold reception and wary glances made it clear. Garibaldi, with his wild charisma and red-shirted loyalists, was seen more as a threat than a hero. Undeterred, he crossed into Lombardy, that restive, elegant land pressed under the iron boot of Austrian rule. There he offered his sword to the provisional government of Milan, brave citizens who had dared to rebel against the might of the Habsburgs. The First Italian War of Independence had begun, and though it would ultimately fail, Garibaldi gave it colour, courage, and two brief flashes of triumph, minor victories at Luino and Morazzone. They were small sparks, but sparks nonetheless. Then came the crushing blow. On the 23rd of March 1849, in Novara, the Piedmontese army was shattered by Austrian forces. The dream of unity dissolved like smoke on the battlefield, but Garibaldi did not retreat into silence. He turned his gaze to Rome. There, in the very heart of Catholic power, another fire had been lit. The Roman Republic, a radical experiment in liberty carved from papal lands. Its spiritual architect was Mazzini, the tireless idealist, but its sword would be Garibaldi. Together they formed the soul and muscle of revolution. But across the sea, France had other ideas. Louis Napoleon, seeking to win favour with Catholics at home, sent troops to crush the Republic. And so, once again Garibaldi found himself outnumbered and surrounded. But he was never one to be cowed. On the 30th of April 1849, outside the Porta San Pancrazio gate, his ragtag army met the French in bloody battle, and astonishingly won. It was a fleeting, glorious moment, where a man once exiled from his own land stood in defence of its soul. But reinforcements soon arrived, and the siege of Rome began. Inside the city, Garibaldi, bloodied, tired but unbowed, entered the Roman assembly to deliver a speech that would become legend. He stood before them, the very image of defiance, and declared, "Ovunque noi saremo, sarà Roma." Wherever we will go, that will be Rome. And so, on July the 2nd, with 4,000 loyal men, Garibaldi marched out of the Eternal City, not as a fugitive, but as a living flame, determined to keep the revolution alive in the hills and forests of Italy. But the cost was high. Chased by French, Austrian, Spanish, and Neapolitan forces, the journey north was a gauntlet of exhaustion and grief. Along the way, many abandoned the cause, others simply vanished. Garibaldi pressed on, aiming for Venice, the last beacon of resistance. And then, near the marshes of Comacchio, tragedy struck. Anita, his wife, his comrade carrying their unborn child, died in his arms. She had ridden beside him through battlefields and revolutions, from Brazil to Uruguay to the streets of Rome. Her death in that damp and lonely place broke something inside him. He reached San Marino with only 250 men by his side, from thousands to hundreds, from Rome to exile once more, but the fire still burned. Garibaldi's exile from Italy was not one of quiet reflection or surrender. His life, ever driven by passion and rebellion, took him to the distant shores of the Americas and the Pacific, where his name would resonate in surprising corners of the world. Forced out of Italy, Yet again, after the failure of the Roman Republic, Garibaldi's wanderings began in 49. His first stop was Tangier, a city on the edge of North Africa, where he found refuge with Francesco Carpanetto, an Italian merchant who would offer him a taste of a new life. The two hatched a plan to buy a merchant ship with Garibaldi commanding it, a far cry from the battlefields he had known. He travelled to New York in July of 1850 to arrange the purchase, but money, as it so often does, was elusive. The ship was never bought, but Garibaldi's journey was just beginning. In New York, Garibaldi found himself in the heart of Italian exile communities, drawn to the vibrant Masonic lodges of the city. It was here, amidst other revolutionaries and intellectuals, that Garibaldi, ever the free thinker, engaged in discussions on democratic ideals and socialism, ideas that would shape his future actions. He worked briefly for Antonio Meucci in his Staten Island candle factory, but this life of quiet labour did not sit well with him. The fire in Garibaldi's soul was not meant to be quenched by the humdrum of factory life. So, in 51, he left New York behind, setting sail for Central America with Carpanetto. The two first landed in Nicaragua, then journeyed through the rest of the region. Garibaldi's name was now known across the Americas, but he was not a man looking for peace or prosperity. He was a man searching for a cause. This led him to Lima, Peru, where, after meeting revolutionary hero Manuel Sáenz, Garibaldi was given command of a ship named Carmen, an offer that would set him off on one of his most daring adventures yet. With the Carmen, Garibaldi sailed across the vast Pacific Ocean, picking up guano from the Chincha Islands and heading for Canton, China. He passed through Xiamen and Manila, a sailor on a mission that, as always, carried him farther than most men would dare to go. He circumnavigated Australia's south coast before returning to Peru, and then embarked on a second voyage to the United States. This time, from Chile, he carried copper and wool, navigating the treacherous waters around Cape Horn, before docking in Boston and finally New York. It was here, amidst the hustle of American life, that Garibaldi received an unpleasant letter from his employer. The end of his time with the Carmen had come to an end, but Garibaldi, ever the opportunist, soon found himself hired again. This time, his destination was Europe. He joined forces with another Italian, Captain Figari, to buy a ship, the Commonwealth, and set sail for England. After a perilous journey, Garibaldi's ship arrived in Newcastle upon Tyne on the 21st of March 1854. The working men of Tyneside, fiercely proud of their own struggle, welcomed him like a hero. They saw in him the same courage that had defined their own lives, and Garibaldi, though a stranger in a strange land, felt at home in their embrace. But ever restless, after a month in South Shields, he departed, carrying with him not just fond memories, but an inscribed sword, a token of respect from the men of Tyneside, one which would later be carried by his grandson, Giuseppe Garibaldi II, to fight in the Second Boer War. In May 54, Garibaldi's 5 years of exile came to an end. He set sail once more for Genoa, Italy, where his long-awaited return to the land he had fought so hard to free was finally within reach. But the journey that took him across oceans and through revolutions would shape the man who would soon lead Italy in its final fiery struggle for unity. After years spent sailing around the world, chasing trade winds, dodging political enemies, and watching revolutions rise and fall, Giuseppe Garibaldi finally came home. It was 1854, and he was 47 years old. His homeland was still fractured, still dominated by foreign empires, still waiting for someone brave or reckless enough to risk everything for unity. He was tired of war for now, tired of wandering. So he did something completely unexpected. He bought a farm. Thanks to a small inheritance left by his late brother, he purchased half of the island of Caprera, a rugged, sun-drenched rock just off the northern tip of Sardinia. There, Among olive trees and goats, Garibaldi traded his sword for a spade. He lived simply, a quiet farmer with the soul of a soldier, his red shirt now faded by salt and sun. But peace never lasted long in Garibaldi's life. In '59, war once again stirred the Italian peninsula. The Second Italian War of Independence, or, as the French like to call it, the Franco-Austrian War, erupted. It was a tangle of secret diplomacy and power plays between empires. But at its heart was a simple idea. The Austrians needed to go. Italy needed to be free. This time Garibaldi didn't hesitate. He rode out of Caprera like a man reborn. The farmer vanished. The fighter returned. The Piedmontese government, desperate for capable commanders, appointed him Major General. With his trademark flair, Garibaldi formed a band of volunteers called the Cacciatori delle Alpi, the Hunters of the Alps. These weren't polished soldiers in parade uniforms. They were men with fire in their eyes and courage in their bones, and under Garibaldi's command they moved like wolves. At Varese, Como, and throughout the foothills of Lombardy, they clashed with Austrian troops and won. Garibaldi was brilliant, fast, unpredictable, always striking where the enemy least expected. His victories were like sparks in dry grass, igniting Italian hopes across the north. But amid the cheers and battlefield glory, something cut deeper than any enemy blade. Nice, his hometown, the place of his birth and earliest dreams, was gone. Not razed, not occupied, but traded like a bargaining chip. In a backroom deal between the Sardinian Prime Minister Count Cavour and Napoleon III of France, Nice was handed over in exchange for military support. Garibaldi, now a national hero, was crushed. He stood in Parliament in Turin, not as a soldier, but as a deputy, and delivered a thunderous denunciation of Cavour. He had bled for Italy. He had marched, fought, and sacrificed. And now his birthplace, Nizza, as he called it, had been sold off like a cow at market. He would never forget this betrayal.